Good afternoon, everybody, and I'd like to say thank you all very much for coming along this afternoon for what promises to be a very interesting lecture. I'd also like to thank Stephen and PRONI for their willingness to host this event. When Kevin first contacted me a few months ago about coming and possibly speaking, I thought, well, PRONI is the perfect place to do this. So thank you, Stephen, for your willingness to cooperate with us on this event. It's my huge pleasure to introduce you to Kevin Cassidy. Kevin is originally from New Jersey, but now lives in Omaha, Nebraska. He's been active in researching his family history now for over a quarter of a century, and he has many different Irish lines, including a line going back to my own home county of Tyrone. He's a member of the Ulster Historical Foundation, and he's writing a piece about his family history, or an aspect of his family history, for our directory that will be published in a few weeks' time. So Kevin, please come and speak to us, and thank you very much for coming across from America for this. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank PRONI and the Ulster Historical Foundation for hosting, and thank you all for coming. Sorry, I'm trying to get my notes up. Yeah, as the title indicates, we're hopefully going to talk about what American records there are, and hopefully some of your collateral relatives managed to leave a better paper trail of your family history across the Atlantic than was kept here or survives here in Ireland. And the first thing that I would encourage everybody who's here today is to identify who your collateral immigrant relations may be. Identify your ancestral couples, and which ones of them had descendants that emigrated to North America. Quite a few children of every family seem to emigrate. I think it would be very unlikely, if not extremely unlikely, that there'd be a family after family, generation after generation, where everybody stayed in Ireland. In addition to going across the Irish Sea, many came across the Atlantic Ocean and settled in North America. And trying to identify that place of settlement we'll talk about today in the United States. And then you might, if you're not sure that people did go, take a second look at the records that your Irish ancestors created here, because in 1870 Anne Gorman was born here in Belfast, and her birth certificate specifically references the name of the father and that his residence is in America. He did come back to Ireland to collect his family, and they all emigrated to Massachusetts. But if you hadn't had any clue before then, that's one place that might give you a hint that there is emigration in that generation. I'd say this is the standard record for American research, and then by comparison, with the loss of so many Irish census records, that your first full census isn't until 1901. This is pound for pound the best record to start with. It gives you a snapshot of a family every 10 years. That's mandated this year as the census year, so on April 1st the census will be tallied. That's our census day this year, and they'll use those numbers to adjust the House of Representatives for the 2022 elections, and then those numbers will affect the 2024 presidential election. And most of the United States Census records do survive from 1790 to the present. We have a privacy restriction of only 72 years. So the 1940 census is currently available. So both of my late parents were in that census, but neither of my in-laws are in the census yet. In 1950, when that's released in a couple of years, I expect to find them. That's just an example shot of a census record from one specific census. And the interesting thing there is in 1870, they don't identify how the people are related. So I want to give you just a quick reminder. Never put relationships into a record You can think what they might be, but don't settle on something until you have proof. There's a family about halfway down the page, Thomas Brown, Margaret Brown, they're both adults. 2 8-year-old boys, both named Brown, and a 3-year-old girl named Brown. Looking at it, it's a husband and wife and their 3 children, and likely the boys are twins, and they've probably lost a child or 2 in between the boys' births and the daughter's birth. Actually, what it is they are all related, but Thomas Brown and Margaret Brown were both widowed, and one boy that's 8 is his, and the other 8-year-old is hers. And ironically, before she was Mrs. Thomas Brown, she was Mrs. John Brown. So the stepson is correctly identified as Brown, but he's the son of John Brown, not the son of Thomas Brown. And it doesn't distinguish, unfortunately, with this record, you're not able to determine with this record alone which boy goes with which parent, and then the 3-year-old daughter is their first child together. The census from can people hear me if I don't speak on the mic? Am I loud enough? And is my accent okay? Can everyone understand me?
You need the mic.
Not in the back.
I do or don't?
You do.
I do, okay. From 1790 to 1840, it's of limited value. It was a statistical head count, so you get the head of the household to name, which is almost invariably a gentleman, a widowed lady, or the owner of the property is a lady. It'll be a woman, but ordinarily it's going to be a male head of household, and then just slash marks telling you how many males and females in various age categories. Starting in 1850, though, you do start to list every member of the household by name. It doesn't tell you how they're related, but it does give you a first and a last name for everybody in the household. So it's a good example of sometimes people pop up that you've been looking for, like there's Uncle Jimmy. He's at least we know in 1850. We don't know where he is in 1860, but you have an idea where he was in 1850. 1870 would list, that's the first census after the Civil War, and they recorded which men could vote, and then whether each individual in the census, whether their parents were of foreign birth or not. So, a lot of people will go back and find that that comes in handy to determine which generation is the immigrant generation and use that information. In 1880, that's a big jump in terms of quality. Instead of being a vertical orientation, it's usually more of a horizontal one because more questions were asked. And it does specifically list the street address before 1880. If they're in Chicago or New York, you don't know what street they're living on. You just know they're in a specific district. And then also in 1880, they start to record how everyone is related to the head of the household. So it could be stepson, mother-in-law, servant. In 1890, there was a census, and it was the only American census that was taken similar to how they're done here, where it was one census, one family. Instead of having multiple families on a single sheet, every family had their own individual census. Unfortunately, in 1921, there was a fire where the records were kept, and the records weren't actually destroyed by flame, they were destroyed by the water to put out the flames. And in 1933, Congress finally decided that unfortunately there was nothing that could be salvaged, but it takes an act of Congress to destroy an important public record. And in 1933, what remained of the 1890 census was formally destroyed. There are a few remnants, but there are very few. They fit on a single microfilm. So if you do have someone from Jersey City, you're in luck, but most of the rest of the country, you're at a loss. In 1900, there were immigration and naturalization questions, along with demographic information about how long a couple had been married. Was it a first or a second marriage? How many children had every woman given birth to, which is a helpful hint. So many Irish widows in 1911 didn't, since they were widowed, they didn't have to answer how many children they had delivered and how many were still living. But in the United States, both in 1900 and 1910, the question was tied to the woman, not to her marriage. And then 1910 is another helpful one because it does identify if the gentleman was a Civil War vet. Obviously, this is 45 years after the end of the war, so it's quite a few of them had passed by that point. In 1890, there was a special veterans census that was kept with the main census, so most of it was lost, but fortunately, if they were kept alphabetically, and Kentucky through Wyoming survive. If your state is alphabetically before Kentucky, so Kansas back up to, I think it's Alabama is the first one, then they were lost. In 1920, 1930, 1940, they continue to ask other interesting questions. 1930 particularly asked, do you own a radio? What's a radio? Sorry. In 1850, 60, 70, and 1880, there were mortality schedules. I know that civil registration of deaths started here in 1864, and in England and Wales in 1837, and in Scotland in 1855. So you can have nationwide death registries, but in the United States, we don't have that until pretty much after the 1900s. But we did at least have a 1 in 10 year equivalent when the census was taken in these 4 census years. So you definitely want to take a look at those if the person died the year before the census. So if the census day was June 1st, 1850, it would be everything from May 31st, 1850 back to June 1st of 1849. And here are some other examples of the census orientation. The upper left is an 1850 census, and it's a newly arrived Duxbury family from England who, ironically, even though they were English, they're in the Irish famine books. There's those ship lists because they came over in that late 1840s era, and they settled in Salem, Massachusetts. They heard they were done burning witches, so they thought it'd be safe to go there. The upper right is an 1880 census, so that again will identify the street address and then each individual's relationship to the head of household. And then the lower left is the 1900 census. Oh, in addition, the 1900 census alone will list the month and year of birth of every person in the household. So if you're trying to find a baptismal record or a birth registration, it can it can help you to find that. Although I guess when I found my great grandmothers in it, they were quite a bit younger than I was expecting, and my aunt told me that Irish women lie about their age. So I'm in a room of Irish women. Is that true, or is there some American gal over there telling lies?
Depends on what age they are. When they're younger, they tend to be younger. When they get older, they tend to be really older. You know, you're 90 when you die.
Well, she's 97 now.
30, you know.
She's 97 now, so I call her every couple of weeks. So when I get back, I will let her know that. And then, and the right is another example. And that's the 1910. So you know the orientations are similar and change. The family dynamics may change. The lower left is a widowed woman with her brother and her male boarders and her children. And the neat thing about that is, if you didn't know what her maiden name was before, you have a pretty good idea, since she's living with her brother, that unless he's a half brother and they're related through their mothers, but in this case he was her full brother, so we did get that reiteration of it helps reiterate what her maiden name was. And then there's surprise entries. In that census in particular, there's someone in that household who, yes, he's her son, but no, he doesn't live with her. He's actually back in a farm here in County Tyrone. He was left with family relatives, and so sometimes you find bonus information. He's not in the 1910, but he was in the 1905 state census, which I'll mention state census is here shortly. And then by 1910, the lady is remarried, and it identifies both she and her husband are in a second marriage. So it gives you the idea of you have work ahead of. I think I turned it off. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Continuing on, the 1920 is in the upper left-hand corner. The highlighted sections is two families, both the head of household is Joseph Cassidy. One household is the father, the other household is the adult son, and they're listed with the both of their wives. And it just as this, it gives you the street address and standard fare. The upper right-hand corner is a 1930 census. So this is after the partition in Ireland, so the information recorded is going to be different. If the Irish people were from the Irish Free State counties, they would identify themselves as such. If they were from Northern Ireland, they would identify themselves as such. Sometimes they get mistranscribed, and the two ladies on the very top page were from County Sligo, so they said they were from Western Ireland, which makes sense to me, but the original transcription said they were from the West Indies. And I know that Irish people wound up in the West Indies, but those two ladies were not among them. But that did, if you were looking, that can be helpful, that you have the right people, that someone from Belfast wouldn't say they're from Western Ireland. Somebody from Cork wouldn't say they're from, or hypothetically wouldn't say they're from Western Ireland. Part of Cork would be considered West, I guess, but Dublin certainly isn't Western Ireland, or very bad things have happened to the rest of the island if Dublin's the West. Then the lower left hand is the 1930, again, that has the radio question. You have surprise entries. There's a gentleman who the story is that he didn't stay, live with the family. He would just come spend the day during there, but he's listed in it. And what my aunt says is my mother must not have been home that day, because there's no way he'd be listed as a member of our household if she had been there. But there he is. And then the 1940 is, again, that one does identify who the interviewer spoke to. So there's an X next to the informants. So those are just some of the bits. In addition to the federal census, the United States also has state and local censuses. Many states would take them in between. The federal census years would always end in a 0, so 1850, 60, and so on. So Massachusetts had state censuses in 1855 and 65. New York had them as listed. And in 1870, an interesting thing happened. There was an undercount in some localities' opinions. So Philadelphia and New York City were allowed to have a second census. So the original census was taken in June of 1870 and following, and then in December of 1870 and January of 1871, those two localities were allowed to do a second enumeration. So if you are looking for people, that's something to keep in mind. Chicago was also not happy with their count, but they were not allowed to do a second count. They did do a count of their population again, and what they did, instead of issuing a federal census, they collected the information, and their city directory the following year had information, number of males and number of females in each household. So that's essentially a census substitute. Normally city directories don't give that detail. But in New York City in 1890, they were told, no, we're not going to give you the money to do a second count. And the city decided, in 1890, the city of New York was just the island of Manhattan and a few parts of the Bronx. And they decided to send the police department out for 3 weeks in September and October. And it's a very, matter of fact, the person's name, their gender, and their age. There's no identification how they're related, although it does say where they're exactly living. Iowa has censuses in these next two lines, and I have the 1925 highlighted because that's, at least in American circles, is considered to be the best census that was ever taken. One question in particular is, who are your parents and where were they married? So if you have a 100-year-old woman in 1925 answering that question, you're getting information from quite a while ago. And so here are some examples of this. The upper left is New York's 1855 census, and to kind of parrot this, in this federal census, it asks you where you're born from 1850 onward. So since it's a state census, they assume that most people, or at least a lot of people, might be born in New York. So if you were born in New York, you were asked what county in New York were you born in. So that can help you identify where exactly in the state you need to look further. In the upper right-hand corner is the 1856 Iowa census, and the Savage family on the bottom there are originally from Kilcoo and County Down, and they are in the United States by 1850, and have the various information. You can see that the last two children are born in Iowa, and then they have an elderly woman living with them who's born in Ireland. And now it doesn't identify how the people are related, but given the fact that she's an older widowed woman living with a couple that has a different last name, you always want to consider, might she be the wife's mother? And in this case, you'd be correct. The lower left-hand corner is that 1890 police census. So the bottom two there, Peter Goodwin and Mary Goodwin, you know they're living at 546 46th Street. It's actually West 46th Street. And Peter's 30 and he's male. Mary's 25 and she's female. And then the right-hand lower corner is yet another example of how state censuses may have been collected. And then they do make updates. The upper left-hand corner is the 1865 Minnesota census. So you basically get the name and then some column checks. But then by 1875, they seem to follow more of the federal pattern that's coming up by 1880. So you get, the age and then place of birth, and then the parents' places of birth. And then here is the Iowa census from 1925, which is 2 pages. It's and in the handouts, I do give lists of websites and some books at the end of the handout. Ancestry.com has an excellent collection, and at least in the States, it is available. Hopefully, your libraries have access to for patrons. I'm seeing a head shake no, so I. Contact a friend in America and they can look stuff up for you and get back to you. But the Brennan family in the lower left corner, and then it identifies what Mrs. Brennan's maiden name was, and then you also find out what her mother's maiden name, what her grandmother's maiden name was. Vital records would be yet another good resource. The census record is a good way for you to identify, is this the correct Irish family that I'm looking for that's come over to America? And then the vital records would be one where you might actually start to break down a brick wall that the states have varying degrees of collecting the information. Marriages generally start first. It's usually going to be the earliest of your 3 records, and compliance varies. Some time periods in some localities will have a low compliance. Other times it's pretty good. And information will change over time. They'll ask the questions in different ways. For example, when a child is born, the question of number of previous births, number still living, is going to give you a different answer than number of child of mother, number still living. You have to think carefully what question's being asked, because sometimes there's like 4 and 4, and you think of a 4 born, 4 living, and that's not necessarily what's indicated. And this is a standard, it's a 2-page spread. So the right-hand side is the death certificate of an Irish immigrant named Hugh Goodwin. And the thing to remember is that it's a two-sided document, so the second page of his isn't available, it's not visible. I decided just for simplicity's sake, but you want to make sure to look at the back or look at the second page on the microfilm, because they have the note there, you know, 2 physicians, 2 undertakers, and it'll give information, you know, how, you know, who's the informant, you know, how are they related to the deceased, and who's in charge of the burial. Here's some examples of some New York City 1887 marriage records, and you become familiar with the locality. In New York City from 1866 to 1888 had basically a duplicate registration. The certificate on top would come into the office, filled out by the pastor or the judge, and then the clerk would make a one-line entry in the lower left-hand register of marriage is there. So the handwriting would be in a different hand, and it's going to be stored and saved in a different place. So if there's a fire in one place, there's not a fire in another, the record survives. And it does identify who the mother and father were of both spouses, if possible. If you look carefully on the bride, Julia Heffernan's father is listed as Richard, but her mother's name is left blank, and you can actually see that in the register. It's the only one. It's about a quarter of the way down. Over on the right hand side you'll see one box. I'm sorry, my pen with the red light doesn't work. And then on the right hand lower corner is the parish register, just to show the difference between the amount of information collected by the civil authorities, including the occupational and other information, and then in the parish register you just find out that John married Julia, and those are the witnesses and the pastor that performed the ceremony. You always want to get both, because oftentimes there might be something that might be a notation, or one handwriting may be easier to read than another, but it is just a example of how civil records can oftentimes give more information in the United States than a sectarian record, although that can change over time. And marriage records exist in various sorts. There's marriage bans, marriage contracts, marriage bonds. Most useful in current research is, or easiest to find, would be the marriage registers and marriage certificates. And then when states have marriage licenses, and those are technically different. A marriage certificate records a marriage that's taken place. A marriage license is an official's vowing that there's a couple that's eligible to marry, and that here's the license to say they're eligible to marry, so go ahead and perform the ceremony. Occasionally, marriages that have a license didn't take place, but they did collect the information, so you might be able to find who the parents were, especially the mother's maiden name, that isn't elsewhere available. Parental consent for minors can give other interesting data. I've come upon one such case where the birth certificate was attached to the marriage license, or a baptismal certificate, so it would identify what parts of the city the child lived, or if they lived somewhere else. And ironically, divorce records is a good place for marriages, because in the divorce petition, the first thing you want your marriage to be ended by divorce, you have to establish that you're married in the first place. So my name is this, I married this person on this date at this place. So if you're having trouble finding a marriage record, but you know they divorced, if you can find the divorce record and they're open to the public, sometimes there's restrictions for time, but if they are available, that might be a place to find out some marriage information, ironically. Here are some examples as time evolves. New York was one of the last to implement the marriage license. They held on for quite a while that, take the people at their word and perform the marriage ceremony, and then, but the compliance was low. Not every marriage that took place was being recorded with the city, So the state eventually has a license, and then, so the city clerk would issue the marriage license, and then the Department of Health would collect a marriage certificate. And then in the lower right-hand corner is is an example of a parish record. These are all from 1917. It's a German immigrant marrying an Irish immigrant, and you get quite a bit of detail. And after seeing this, you can imagine that from 1908 to 1937, the pastors were overwhelmed with all the paperwork, and the Department of Health stopped collecting the marriage certificates, and then you just have the licenses, which do include a certificate in the upper right-hand corner. But again, the name of the couple, if the bride's been married before, it'll identify that. It'll identify if they're married or divorced. This can be a place where you can get details about a divorce if they aren't open to public examination. They were required, and then it also, in this time period, it would be divorce for cause. So if it was adultery or whatnot, those notes would be there. It's kind of interesting what those little footnotes can have. And then in the case of 1917, this couple got married in a Catholic ceremony, so their baptismal details are there. So it says where in Ireland Mrs. Seeger was from, and then Mr. Seeger was apparently a evangelical Christian, but he became Catholic, so they had the Catholic baptismal date from a couple of weeks earlier, but I was able to find his original baptism as an infant back in Germany, but I was able to also find information because his parents' names were correctly identified. Death records are the next set of vital records that are important. For wills and probates, estates and estate settlements. If there isn't a will, this government has written a will for you, and it'll decide how your estate will be distributed. And we have obituaries in the United States, especially earlier periods, and that's an amazing thing. If you are able to find relatives in those rural newspapers in particular, they're weekly. They're usually printed on Friday, and they're only about 8 pages an issue. So you only have 8 pages to look at week by week. There's only 52 weeks in a year. It's a lot more fun to find an obituary. They're usually page 1 than looking for, if you don't know an exact date of death, to try to find it in Chicago or New York newspapers where there's multiple papers and they're printed every day. But this is an example where they do give quite a bit of information about this woman, who her survivors are. There's other death pieces that'll list who the pallbearers were, so that gives you some clue. Those are generally going to be close friends or nieces or nephews, and not children of the deceased, but they'll be connected somehow. Then in the upper right-hand corner is a death certificate where it does identify that the lady was from County Cork, and it does correctly identify who her father was. But unfortunately, the further the death is along the line who the informant is, well, this informant was her American-born daughter who never met her Irish grandparents, so she didn't remember what the grandmother's name was, so it's left blank. And then in the lower left-hand corner is the cemetery record of the plot. So there's multiple burials in this plot, and they keep track of who's buried where, and it's a little detective story. There's the second entry is a little boy named William Kling, who unfortunately only lived 5 minutes, but since I didn't know who Kling was by process of elimination, I wondered if that might be the oldest daughter's married name, and sure enough that did turn out to be the case. But keep in mind that in a grave, obviously, they're going to be connected. You just don't have someone who has no connection whatsoever to the other burials to just pop up in a grave. So these are all close relations of the Riley family. And then there was a fire that destroyed the original records. They have notes there on the bottom of the card that give details for the 2 infants that they lost. And then the father was buried there before the fire as well. Just some more examples of how death information can be collected. The Tregonings are an Irish family. I've never seen that name. It's not in McLysagh's surname book, but they were in New York City by 1840, so they're pre-famine immigrants. And it was interesting that both the husband and the older son died in 1856 within a few months of each other, and they were registered. Not a lot of details. They're buried together. And then in 1883, when the wife died, it did identify who her parents were. So these are, again, people from the early 1800s that if she had died in Ireland, you wouldn't get that information on her death certificate. Or if you're descended from her sister, if you can make those connections, you might be able to pick up that earlier generation from these vital records, whether they're marriage or or death records. And then the Goodwins are a set of brothers in 1897. The one brother dies in an accident, so strangers handle the death certificate and his parents' names aren't identified. In 1901, the father and mother are identified, but the mother's maiden name is not included. That wasn't the standard at the time. And then fortunately in 1926, they did ask for the mother's maiden name, so that's an example of 3 Irish immigrant brothers giving and leaving different levels of information. In the English family, the wife dies in 1890, and it did identify who her parents were. Unfortunately, in 1899, when her husband died, it didn't identify who his parents were. And then in the Mulligan was Mrs. English's first husband, and when he died, death details were recorded in 1866. And then you need to track the family. They do move. Obviously, if somebody moves from Ireland to the United States, moving within the United States isn't beyond the realm of possibility. So the Gormans leave paper trails in Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. The death certificate, unfortunately, is the one most likely to have mistakes. People are grieving, or it may be a granddaughter who never knew her grandparents. For example, is Luella Young versus Luella Brown in 1989. A newspaper obituary mentioned that the deceased was the son of Luella Young. And we knew where to look for census records and could find them, and sure enough, there was a Luella Young that was in the right place, and she's about the right age, and you do all the research, and then it turns out that Luella Young never had children. Well, how can Luella Young be your ancestor if she never had children? And then you have to, rule it out, and then you go back and you find that, the deceased mother wasn't Luella Young, it was Luella Brown. So it's, a one-syllable, relatively common name, but the irony was that there really was a Luella Young who was a contemporary and a neighbor of Luella Brown, and momentarily you get off, could be a few weeks, could be a few months, and if you don't follow through diligently enough, it might still be in someone's family tree. So always verify if you can, or verify to have certainty. Deaths also create probates and wills. On the left is the handwritten, they rewrite the will when it comes in, and then not every will goes off without a hitch, so lawsuits can be created. And so the will on the left created the lawsuit on the right, and it does give some interesting details about this Irish immigrant family. Birth records, obviously if the person's born in America, they're not, they're tied to Ireland. It's obviously not the same as the Irish immigrant, but sometimes the birth record will give origin information of the parent. They vary over time, again, from state to state. A child's name isn't necessarily, just like on the Irish record, it may or may not be listed. This one, it's left blank. He's male, but you don't know his first name. And then they do give a little bit more information about birth order, and then the marital condition is that are the parents married or not. The upper left-hand corner is a civil birth register from Connecticut. And the reason I have it there, it was interesting that when I was looking at these at FamilySearch.org, which the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints runs, and that is free, that is something you can use from the privacy of your own home via the internet, and most of the records are becoming available through digitization. Some of them do require that you have to be at a family history center to view the image, but these for Bridgeport, Connecticut do not. But the upper left-hand corner is an 1885 birth register, so they have Morris Riley's birth there. And then I found that there was another set of records, so I looked at it, I thought, well, why do they have like two sets of birth records for the same time period? And the lower left-hand one is they're handwritten, and what I discovered is in the margin it says St. Augustine R.C. Church, and then if you scroll around, there's the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church, and it seems to be what someone did is they went to the churches that practice infant baptism and said, hey, can we look at your baptismal rolls to update our birth records? And apparently they were told, sure. Can't imagine that happening today, but it was interesting because it does list the child's name and the parents' names and the mother's maiden name. And what's also interesting with this one is the oldest sister has the typeset one, but she's not in the church version. And then the fifth one has a typeset for the civil, but not the church version. He's the only one that, and there's several that don't have the civil record, they're just in the church records. This lady had 11 children, 9 of whom were born in this time period. But what I surmised is that he's baptized under the name, the initials M-A-U-C-Y. And his name is Morris, and they spell it M-O-R-R-I-S in the typeset. And then the handwritten, I'm assuming they're trying to go for Mossy. And in America we had a show called Bewitched, and the lead witch, her father's name is Maurice. So when I saw that I had a Maurice Mahoney on my family tree, I assumed it was Maurice, and I kept saying that, and my mother finally corrected me. She's like, I think it's pronounced Morris. And then it dawned on me, I would never call somebody Fitz Maurice. So there can be duplications that aren't necessarily intended. So you'd be open to looking for those. And the two records in the middle, childbirth over the years has evolved and changed in the ways that it's recorded and in the ways that it's handled. But there's an interesting book called Brought to Bed, which is a history of childbearing in the United States from colonial days to the early 1900s. And it talked about how it was very much a female dynamic. Obviously the woman delivering is a woman, and what she wanted was a room full of women that had preferably delivered themselves, or if they hadn't delivered themselves, at least been to a number of deliveries. That way if problems did arise, you had a room full of women with expertise. Okay, what did we do and what result did we get? And hopefully, and then as time went on, the doctors started to get called in for the tragic cases, and then to try to prevent the tragic cases from being tragic, they started to want to come in earlier and not at the last moments. So this is an example where there must have been a midwife, and then the doctor was called in, but they each filed a birth certificate, and the information given is the date of birth in question is different by a day, but it's the same, the child has a name in one and he's listed as male in the other, but it does list that it's the same father and the same mother, so it is and the same address, so it's definitely the same birth, but the number of children previously born, number living is different, and it's always, you always want to look at duplicate records and see, is one completely right and one's completely wrong, or are they both right in some areas and both wrong in others? And then in the upper right-hand column is Massachusetts, that Anne Gorman, who was born here in Belfast and unfortunately died before her first birthday. She had a younger brother that was born in Massachusetts, and his details were recorded in that upper right document. Naturalization is the process where a foreign-born person can become a United States citizen. It's been a two-step process throughout the years, the declaration of intent, and after a certain period of living in the States, that would change statutorily from year to year, and then after the declaration, it'd be another period of time, and a petition to citizenship would be filed, and then as time went on, after 1906, it became a federal paperwork process. They could still naturalize in state courts, but they would use the federal paperwork. This is a pre-1906 one, and what was interesting with this one, I didn't have space to put on the copies, but he was asked questions, and the court stenographer made notes. So they have the questions of, like, how many houses are there in the legislature? What form of government does the United States have? And it's interesting to read. You have the question, and then you have the answer, and you know that this specific immigrant, as they became a citizen, word for word answered those answers. And then in 1922, I was talking to Stephen earlier about centenaries coming up. Well, in the United States in 1920, the 19th Amendment, extended the right to vote to women. So that created an issue of which women, would be eligible to vote and which would not. There was an issue from 1907 through 1922 of ladies that had married foreign-born men, American citizen women that would lose their citizenship because they had become citizens of their husband's country. And so that's something to keep in mind, that you might find an American-born woman having to go through a naturalization process to gain her right to suffrage. This is an example of a post-1906 one, where they added the certificate of arrival, which makes it nice that you can easily find the citizen's arrival in the country. And then the lower left is his declaration, the upper right is his petition. And looking at the witnesses, who are the witnesses? One is his aunt and the other one is his brother-in-law. And the thing to remember with naturalization and declaration is fighting for the U.S. Army did not make you a citizen, but it did shorten the process. You didn't have to declare your intent. You could immediately petition after your service. And then another thing with the declaration is if you were a child who came over before you were 10, you didn't have to declare an intent. But if you were a child whose father became a citizen before you were 10, then you automatically became a citizen, as did his wife. Or a foreign-born woman who married an American citizen, whether he was native-born himself or a naturalized citizen, she became a citizen at the same time she became a married woman in that circumstance. Now, passenger lists vary in helpfulness. There's multiple ports of entry, and I know this is about American records, but don't neglect those incoming and outgoing records. Those can be very handy for those of you looking. I'd like to highlight the example of Binnie Core Corcoran and Alice Conlon Core. They were both originally from Upper Cragen in County Armagh. Is that pronounced right? Sorry if it isn't. And they settled in Omaha. And Binnie is found in the UK incoming list coming over. And then a few weeks later, both she and Alice are in the outgoing list, and then they're in the incoming list in Ellis Island because the daughter came back for her mother to bring her to America. So that might be a reason, if you're having difficulty finding great-grandma's headstone, be open to the possibility that great-grandpa's in the church cemetery here in Ireland, but great-grandma might have been brought over to America or Canada, and that's why you're not finding her. And then if she is there, then you have the likelihood that hopefully her death certificate captured, fuller information. Another example of, we'll discuss when this slide comes up, but this is the Duxbury family in the upper left-hand corner. They're an English family, but they're captured in the Irish famine era. And since you have the family and the ages, you can match them to the census to have an idea that you have the right people. If you just have, Dennis Buckley or Mary O'Reilly, that's not usually enough information in that era to know that unless you have a family tradition or a record elsewhere that tells you the name of the ship or the specific date of passage, that you have the right person. And then the lower right-hand one, as time went on, they did start to record, and we know we have the right ladies because it says, where are you going to? And they're going back home to Mrs. Corcoran's home, and her home is in Omaha, in Nebraska, in the United States. And then in the upper slides, you have other examples of the entries to the upper left-hand one is the Patrick Buckley for naturalization. He's coming to the United States. He was a widower, so as you'd imagine, he has a 3-year-old child, and that would be quite a voyage to take. I envision, what happened is his sister-in-law came back to Ireland and then brought he and his son to New York, and that would have given them 2 adults to mind and almost 4-year-olds, because you figure it's at least, it's probably a 2-week trip in that era. It's 1897, and 4-year-olds can get into things that, the father would have to sleep at some time. But the 3 of them do manage to get to the States. The father and his son, after he naturalizes, go back to Ireland. And the middle on the right, on the top, he's initially listed as a foreigner, and they have to cross it out because he's an American citizen. So the entry is essentially the same, but there is a duplicate because he has entered again. Both he and his son are now American citizens. The lower left here is from 1909, and the right, that's a 2-page spread, and it'll give the name of your close contact here in Ireland, and then who are you going to see. So that way, again, it helps you to differentiate one John O'Reilly from another. And sometimes, family groups travel separately. So a little girl was left in Ireland while her parents were in the United States. The father went first, then the mother and some of the children, but the oldest daughter was left, and she came over with her aunts, who have a different last name. And as one can imagine, and I don't know that this is the case, but it would make sense to me, they detained them. And then the girl's mother had to come pick them up, so to make sure that everything was, right and true. And then, so that extra 3rd document was created. The 2 Miss McAuliffes and their daughter, or their niece, Miss Sullivan, were detained, and then there's the correct information listing their sister or mother, as the case may be. And then on the bottom here is a border crossing. So John O'Connell in 1923 crossed the border from Canada into the United States, and he was detained and gave quite a bit of information, because I'm fortunate that while I've been doing this for a little over 25 years now, when I started this, both of my godparents were alive, and thankfully they're both alive today. My aunt is 97, she's my father's older sister, and my uncle is 85, he's my mother's older brother. And he had created an interesting list of names, and he had down that there was his grandmother had a sister, Elizabeth, and then he wrote in parentheses with a question mark, Riley. And in 2016, when the vital records became online and searchable through Dublin, I looked and I was able to find John O'Connell's mother, because her name was Katie, and it had O'Connell in parentheses with the question mark. Well, I was able to verify that he was right about that one, and then I was lost for the Riley, but then when I saw this, I was like, Mrs. Elizabeth Riley. I wonder if that's, and sure enough, that's, she had come over to Connecticut, married here, and had 11 children, while she did have 11 children, she stopped having children at age 42. And I'm going to mention just a little funny story for these 4 sisters from County Cork. The other sisters had children until they were 44, 44, and 45. And the gal who had children until she was 45 didn't get married until she was 42. And I was quite surprised in the 1901 census when I saw there was a 10-month-old child living in that household. And then in 1911, she's widowed, and she has 2 more children. So I just want to mention that little, we're proud. I'm always descended from the ones at the end. So if it wasn't for 40-year-old mothers, I wouldn't be here. Newspaper, the difference between an obituary and a death notice, the obituary would just basically give a lot more information. The death notice gives you just enough information to attend the funeral, more or less, and then the obituary will go into life details. Where did they come from? Where did they fight in the Civil War? Were they a bank president? Were they married previously? That optical character recognition makes newspaper research much easier. And the Boston Pilot has online, if you look under lost friends, there's newspaper ads were taken out by people looking for Irish immigrants that they'd lost track of, and it's an interesting resource. Some examples of the obituaries here. The left-hand one is Elvira Young. She's a native of Canada, and it does mention exactly where in Canada she's from, because at the very end it says she's survived by a sister residing near Belleville, Ontario, where Mrs. Young was born, and it gives her date of birth. And it also gave details about 2 cousins that she had that lived in the community, and then she's survived by 2 men named Lawrence, 2 married women, and then a boy named Ray and a daughter named Ruby Young, and her name is Young, so you can surmise that she was probably married twice. Well, first to Mr. Lawrence and then to Mr. Young. If it bleeds, it leads. So Elizabeth Sullivan was walking home from the dentist and apparently had a heart attack and died in Central Park at 86th Street and Central Park West. So it made the newspaper. Ran into the street of fire. This gentleman was a blacksmith, and I suspected, since he died of massive burns, that something was up. It took a while, but thanks to that optical character recognition, this finally came up. And when the police officer asked him how he had been burned, he refused to tell. "I'll tell no one but the priest," said the sufferer. He died the next day, and I can't find a follow-up story. I'm intellectually curious as to how he came to be on fire. Marriage and city notes there. Peter Lowe and Catherine Carr have been licensed to wed. It's actually Peter Loy and Catherine Core. So always be careful with spelling. And then this seems to be an American phenomenon. Stories run about this land that this Irish person's going to inherit, and then you follow up with looking for any shred of substantiation, and you can't find any. But this is a tall tale in my family's story, and my great-grandmother's brother and their younger brother wrote letters to her nephew, who was an attorney, and I'm sure it did give information. It did identify an earlier generation that other papers don't survive. I know that their grandparents were James Benson and Mary Downs because of these letters, and then this gentleman was their cousin, who doesn't mention my family at all, but he's claiming the same land. He was an Irish immigrant who became an attorney in San Francisco. And I can't find follow-up stories about, this is a hoax or nonsense, but this story was picked up again and again and again. So there might be some interesting newspaper stories that your collaterals created, true and untrue. Military records, there's the various cards that were created to organize it. This record just finally tells you what the S stood for in Dennis S. Buckley. It was Sullivan for his mother's maiden name. It identifies where he was born in Ireland. They don't always do that. But the Register of Enlistments on the upper page there, when an Irish person is asked county, there's a word coming soon. So when they were asking county of birth of the Americans, they sometimes capture the county of birth of the Irish. So this one, you're able to know that he's from County Sligo. That's one differentiation between the Irish immigrants and others that I've noticed. Here's an example of that 1890 Civil War census that did survive the fire. And then on the right is another military. There was a draft during the Civil War, so the Duxbury men in Minnesota were asked, and they gave their information. And then finally, getting close to the end here, county histories are probably of a lot of interest because they were very common, especially in the 19th century, and those rural counties give you details about how the county was founded, who the bigwigs were, and then there's biographical sketches, and oftentimes have either a sketch drawing, or if once photographs became available, there could be a photograph. And then this Bernard McCartan, he's from Kilcoo in County Down, and he gives his date of birth and various details. And then the homestead records are a way that Americans could take government lands, what land remained, starting in 1862, and it was a typical government process, lots of paperwork, and you have depositions from the neighbors, and they had to live on the land for 5 years, and then they didn't have to be naturalized to begin, but they did have to be naturalized to end, and women could participate in this program as well. And the three that I'm most familiar with are Richard Duxbury. He was an English native. He naturalized in Nebraska. Rufus Young is a native of Canada, and he naturalized in Nebraska. And then Josephus Carnes is a native of Kentucky, so he didn't have to naturalize. All three gentlemen served in the Civil War, and there's quite a detailing their service, and then detailing information about. And this is just I deliberately just showed that it's a lot of pages, and this is probably just about half of the pages that are in there. And there's some interesting things because there's a fire and it destroys his paperwork, so he has to swear an affidavit as to the fire. And it was nice to use the newspaper to show that contemporaneous to his claim, on the bottom one, at the fire at R.W. Young's the other day, 2 lads almost lost their lives. And the interesting thing is knowing the fuller story. The son in question is actually his stepson, and then the other is his brother's stepson. So neither of these boys is related to R.W. by blood, but they're fighting to save his home. Obviously, the stepson is related to the wife's claim on the land, so he's interested. And then there's the card of thanks. Those are customary, usually a week or so after a death, but in this case, they have a nice note, and it does identify who Mrs. Young is. Sometimes you'll see things in the newspaper and you can never figure out what the lady's first name was. City directories are a precursor to the phone book when we used to have phone books. They vary from place to place. Here's just an example of several men named Goodwin and their address and what their job is. The upper left one is an example of when Alice Core came to America, she's identifying her husband Peter. Well, Peter died here in Ireland in 1867, but he's still being named through 1906 in Omaha, Nebraska phone books, or city directories. And then their daughter was listed as a servant, and her sister, their other daughter, as well, and then their niece. So you can see that they're even though they're domestic servants, they're still able to be captured in a smaller city directory. Then as time goes on, these three are Bensons. The 2 lower ones obviously live at the same address. James and Mary are siblings, and Mary is a school teacher, and it tells you what specific PS, public school, 183 that she teaches at before she was married. And then the last is, before she remarries, it's Rafferty Ellen, widow of John, and her address. And then the first year that city directory was taken after her subsequent marriage to Hugh Goodwin, he's living at the same address. So it's a good way to track that you have the right people. And that is it. Yes?